Vamos a dar inicio a esta charla que se trata sobre tendencias en el sector geoespacial, que van a emitir los profesores Bruce Gittings y Neil Stuart, directores del programa de maestría en Ciencias de la Información Geográfica. Gracias, profesores. Adelante, por favor.
Bueno, buenos días, buenas tardes ya a todos. A mí me toca hacer la presentación de Mr. Bruce Gittings y Neil Stewart. Bruce Gittings es, bueno, él es ciencista bachelor en el área de geología, geografía y es senior lecturer en la Universidad de Edimburgo, Escocia, y además es el codirector de la maestría en sistemas de información geográfico. Por su lado, Neil Stewart es también académico de la Universidad de Edimburgo y su especialidad también es el área de las geociencias aplicadas, los sistemas de información geográfico y las bases de datos geoespaciales. Ambos están actualmente trabajando junto con la Escuela de Geomensura de la Facultad de Ingeniería de la Universidad Tecnológica Metropolitana. Y nos acompañará también Esteban Soto Márquez. Él es geógrafo de la Universidad de Chile, su especialidad es la aerofotogrametría y es un académico con larga y con vasta experiencia tanto en Chile como en el extranjero. Ellos son entonces quienes van a hacer una presentación y vamos a participar en una conversación con ellos. Adelante, Esteban, por favor.
Bueno, saludar a toda la audiencia. Antes que nada, presentar bueno, los presentó Alejandro, Bruce Gittings y Neil Stewart, con los cuales nos conocemos desde el tiempo que yo fui estudiante de la Universidad de Edimburgo, en el ámbito de la ciencia geográfica. Entonces, ellos van a hacer una breve presentación. Hay servicio de traducción, de manera que cualquier pregunta o formular inquietudes lo pueden utilizar a través de ese servicio, pero si no, si hay problemas en términos técnicos, digamos, términos técnicos muy específicos, geográficos, yo puedo parchar en esa instancia, ¿ya? Entonces yo quisiera dejarlo a ellos. Yo soy la parte, el contacto acá en la Universidad Tecnológica Metropolitana por esta situación de que nos conocemos hace más de 20 años desde Edimburgo. Y ahora Bruce y Neil están viniendo hace aproximadamente 7 años, y evidentemente interrumpidos por el problema de la pandemia. Pero una vez que esto se supere, vamos a continuar con nuestro programa de base de datos espaciales, que es un programa que se está dando hace bastantes años y que está abocado a satisfacer diversas necesidades en la parte de la geomática, como base de datos, análisis espacial y levantamientos terrestres. Así que muy breve voy a dejar a mis amigos y colegas británicos en este momento con usted. Go ahead, Bruce. Neil, please.
Okay, maybe I just begin by saying hola a todos. Disculpe para no hablar español. We're going to speak in English for this little conversation, and I hope that's okay. And thanks very much to Rodrigo and Alejandro and colleagues for inviting us. What we had in mind was to have a short conversation picking up on some of the presentations that we've heard already today, talking as educators from our experience of running this international master's program in GIS. Over the many years now, we've had the privilege to educate students from many countries, including Chile, and to share their experiences and to think about the trends, las tendencias, in terms of how do we prepare the new generation of students for the new challenges, and thinking about geomatics for the next 20 years, and thinking about how do we prepare our students to take on the challenges. I think we've seen some great examples in the presentations already of how you're harnessing the new technologies. And in this session, we want to think a little about the principles and the ideas that we need to give to our students to go forward. So we're delighted to be here and to share some of those experiences with you. And maybe I'll just pass over to Bruce.
Thank you, Neil. I don't know if we need translation services, Esteban. Do you wish to interject anything before I continue?
No, I got some message. It says wonderful translation. No problem. Go ahead.
That's fine.
I'm on fire.
It is working. It is
fine.
working very, very, very good. And don't worry. Go ahead.
Well, it's a great pleasure, as Neil says, to be joining you this afternoon. I think, is it still morning with you? It's still morning with you. It's afternoon with us, afternoon in Edinburgh. So yeah, we're very, very grateful, and we were asked to come along and address some questions in terms of the current trends from our point of view, particularly, as Neil says, those that that we're using to guide our students, and also that we've picked up from organisations in the United Kingdom. So I am involved with the Association for Geographical Information within the United Kingdom, and we hear about advances in geospatial technologies and geomatics there. And we also have an organisation that is part of government in the United Kingdom called the Geospatial Commission, who have actually been given an amount of money to guide the development of geospatial in the UK and advance that. And that's quite an unusual situation in the UK, where government gives money to an organisation that is part of government that is looking at a very specialised field. So certainly within the UK, within Europe, and indeed worldwide, we see geospatial, geomatics as very much growing fields, where there will be much investment over the coming years, and we see our students going out and taking part in that. And I'm sure all of you here today will have similar experiences, because I know that this is as exciting a field in Chile as it is in the UK. Neil, I'll pass back to you.
Okay, so one of the questions which we were asked to respond to was just to summarize what we think are the main trends in geospatial at the moment, those tendencias. I wonder, Bruce, did you want to start off, and I could perhaps share a slide while you're talking?
Yes, that's great, Neil. So I think it's a really exciting time to be working in the area of geospatial, because there are so many different things happening. We've heard today already about drones and the data that these can acquire. We're using drones as well. We're looking at LiDAR data, but I think it's this volume of data, this almost tsunami of data it's sometimes referred to, that is now available. We have more satellites orbiting the Earth than have ever been there before. Many of these are for the purposes of collecting data. Not just national space agencies, but many commercial companies, Google, Microsoft, for example, putting up constellations of satellites. So we have data at all sorts of different scales from all manner of different platforms, whether that be, as I say, satellites, drones, ground survey. We have vehicles driving around our countries collecting data. So one of the things that we are teaching our students is how to deal with these volumes of data, immense volumes of data. So being able to structure that data in databases, and to be able to provide services from these data. It's no longer about holding individual data ourselves. It's about holding data in a corporate sense, sharing that amongst different people within our organizations and indeed beyond our organizations. Providing web services, increasingly important, where data is provided through these services, not raw data, but often the results of analyses are being provided out. And many companies in Scotland are involved in gathering data, creating complex databases, adding analysis procedures to allow the data to be portrayed as real-time information. So we don't send paper maps out anymore. We don't even send PDFs of maps out anymore. The data is available in real time to be consumed by electronic systems through these web services. And as Neil illustrates there, mobile devices is something that I'm very interested in. So it's not just collecting data using mobile devices, although that's going on, whether that be in a formal sense through survey, or whether that be using informal crowd collection of data. So Google, for example, collecting traffic data by examining our individual mobile phones and see how quickly we're moving, but also portraying that data. Location-based services are becoming more and more important. I think they're just at the very beginning of that type of technology, but providing not data, but information to professionals, to the public, based on our particular location, our particular needs, our particular interests. So if you're a tourist, you get very rich information telling you about the local area. If you're interested in volcanic eruptions or tsunamis, and you're trying to give emergency information, all of that is now being conveyed out through these location-based services. So I think we're in a really exciting time where the world is definitely data-centered. This whole concept of data science has become enormously important. The informaticians, the computer scientists have woken up to the complexity of geospatial data and how much of it there is and how that needs to be processed in interesting ways. Using, as the slide suggests, sensor networks. So we're collecting information from the natural world, whether that be examining ice sheets and the retreat of ice sheets, whether that be climatic information, whether that be volcanological information, natural hazards and so on. And also ubiquitous images, not just satellites, not just airplanes, but drones, but cars driving up and down the roads collecting street view data and other particular forms of information. So we not only just get complete coverage. We used to agonize about 20 years ago, we didn't have complete aerial photography coverage in the UK. Now we're expecting that data to be recreated every 3 or 4 years, so that we have a time series and we can look at difference over time. I'll pass back to you, Neil.
Thank you, Bruce. I think that you've touched on 2 really good examples there already. One is that we need to tell our students that the old disciplinary boundaries don't really exist anymore. So we have students every year who come from a traditional, for example, surveying background. But there are many opportunities now which they can go beyond that basic experience that they have. And each person has this amazing opportunity now, as we heard in some of your previous speakers. In BIM, there's a huge explosion of new application areas. Also the fusion of satellite imagery with conventional geographic data is a really important basis for almost all the applications that I work with. And I work a lot looking at change of biodiversity, for example, in tropical parts of the world. And that's impossible to monitor that without using satellite imagery. The retreat of the glaciers in Chile. There are many examples where we need this fusion. So we want people to extend themselves beyond their traditional disciplinary boundaries. We think the future is about talking about the geospatial professional as somebody who has a much broader range of skills. So in our program, we include Earth observation. Everybody has to understand the basis of Earth observation. We teach drone technology and the integration of drone imagery, because we think that techniques like photogrammetry, which many students from geomatics understand, is actually, again, a skill which many students can actually utilize. So I think it's about extending people's range of abilities and encouraging them to think more broadly. And in the slide that we're showing at the moment, we are making connections. We are geographers and geospatial people, but we have to connect with colleagues in informatics, for example, who understand more than we do about handling of big data. But I think we also have to remember that we have a contribution because we understand the nature of that data. And we perhaps have to get the spatial data infrastructure and the quality of that. That's something which we've always held as an important thing that geomatics professionals do. So I think we need to maintain that quality of the basis of the data, but then think about how we now add on these new and exciting areas. And maybe you could take us through some of the other points on this diagram, Bruce.
Yes, no, happily, Neil. I think Neil makes a very good point that it's no longer looking at geospatial in a vacuum. It's no longer just connecting geospatial to geomatics and Earth observation and sort of traditionally closed disciplines. We are now talking to computer scientists, we're talking to engineers, we're talking to biologists, we're talking to ecologists, we're talking to oceanographers. But I guess this diagram is particularly the sort of informatics view of geospatial, that we are using a whole series of standards, some of which have been created for the geospatial world, but many of them are informatics standards. So our computer science colleagues have created these, and we are interfacing between the human, the person that's actually using the information, the web, complex computing infrastructures, distributed computing, the sensor web that I mentioned, so we can be real-time monitoring Earth movements or glaciation movements or climatic change or so on. Certainly there's big data. I think big data is probably an issue we'll come back to, but in some ways it's a bad term because it's not about the data, it's about the information, it's about the knowledge. But there is a huge amount of that, and geospatial is classic big data. We've had big data sets long before other people had big data sets, and they're really diverse and really important, but getting bigger. So it's the size, but it's also the diversity. We've got raster data, we've got vector data, we've got data coming from satellites, we've got data coming from ground survey, we've got data coming from imagery, we've got data coming from all manner of sensors in the sensor web. A huge diversity of data, as well as your national mapping agencies, from LiDAR clouds, point clouds, and so on. And it's gathering all that data together, not necessarily in one place. It's connecting that data through technology, leaving it where it naturally, in the organizations where are its natural home, but then being able to access that data in real time, process it in real time, and provide it as services on the web. So we have this concept of web GIS, which allows us to have these services available. And it used to be simply about downloading a data set, but now much more it's about, many of you will have used services like ArcGIS Online, for example, where the data and the analysis is all online. But we're moving to a situation where you won't use anything that's recognizable as a GIS package, even online. You will simply say, well, I have a data set which is here in the cloud. I want an analysis service that will allow me to overlay that data set with another data set, and it will all be done in the cloud through interconnected services. And that's the vision. That's where we're aiming. But it's dependent on standards. It's dependent on complex, as Neil said, complex information technology infrastructures, but it's this ability to use the cloud, to use distributed technology, not just to collect, but to integrate. I think Neil might say something more about the analysis of this information, but then the dissemination, being able to create online maps, yes, and create a whole manner of other products. It's about maps, but it's also about statistics, it's about information, it's about feeding knowledge not just to decision makers, not just to professionals in geospatial, but also to members of the general public. I'm sure this is happening. I know this is happening in Chile, but we certainly see it here, where increasingly local government, national government are feeding information out to the public in terms of these web services. And you don't have to phone up as you would traditionally have had to do to ask questions of your local authority. When is my rubbish collected, or when will my streets be swept? That information is now all integrated and online. Neil, do you want to say something more about the analysis component? I know that's your particular forte.
Well, I think that the idea of thinking about information rather than data is key to this. And I always tell my students that it's about solving problems with the data. It's not just about having more data, but it's about conducting analysis that helps us to solve real problems. So what you're saying about connecting to the real world needs, connecting to the government's needs, connecting to environmental needs, that I think is the key. So that idea about that it's something special about spatial data, that you can't just use traditional statistics. You have to understand about the organization of spatial data. I think that really is an important principle that we need to keep teaching our students. You know, surveyors know about data quality, we know about error, but that information, we need to find ways in which those measurements and those analyses go through into the products that we create. Overall, the challenge we have is how we prepare students now for this much wider range of careers. You know, that the conventional idea that a surveyor learns about spatial data and spends his life as a surveyor, that is totally changing. And now we have a situation such as this in our last of our substantial slides here, where we're showing that there are trends along the bottom there. What we think of as the core geospatial technologies. It is what we've heard about today. It is about GNSS and positioning. That will always remain. But it's also about understanding that we need to bring in Earth observation data. And it's also about understanding that when we have all these data from scanners, from Earth observation, from GNSS, that actually is just the beginning of our analysis, where we then take that information and convert that into usable information. And if we look across this slide, these are the careers that our students are moving into. And it's a much more interesting range of careers than just the conventional ones which we might think about. So we have people who are working in business intelligence, in completely digital engineering, people who are developing enterprise applications for sharing public information, giving the public back its information. And so we need to train our students about creation of web portals and web mapping, about how to actually link this data with social media so that we can achieve some of these objectives on the right hand side, to do with citizen science, to do with accountable governance, you know, and actually giving people a voice, being able to really participate in processes through the power of geospatial. So I think my message will be, don't underestimate this. As geospatial professionals, we can actually bring information that can make real change. And we're seeing examples of that across the world. And I think we're going to see more of those. So I'll hand back to you now, Bruce, in terms of your kind of take-home thoughts in terms of what we should be teaching our next generation of GIS and geomatics professionals.
Thanks, Neil. Yes, I think we have a real challenge that sometimes we do get lost in our own field, in our own profession as geospatial scientists, as geomaticians. But I think we really do have to connect with broader information technology and make sure that our abilities, our clever spatial analysis, our complicated data is understood, is connected, is used, But as Neil said, spatial is special. So I think we're telling our students to go out there and connect and become part of the information technology world, but also to help professionals in these other IT fields to understand that there is something special about spatial data. You know, I always use the analogy, Neil mentioned statistics, I always use the statistical analogy that, you know, we all kind of know basic statistics, all our students know basic statistics, but when it comes to sort of complicated statistics, often our students can make mistakes. And just in that same way, our information technology colleagues often think they understand spatial, but sometimes actually spatial is special. So we have to deal with this balance, this very careful balance between enthusing about our technology and ensuring that it is appropriately and well used, while also explaining the complexities of that technology and helping others to understand it. So we don't want to get lost in our own profession, and we do want to go out there and make connections, but we do want to help in building these systems, these services. And that's exactly what we're doing with our students. We're sending our students out there with a great deal of breadth. And as Neil said, we get students now who have a huge range of backgrounds. They're not traditional geographers or geomatics backgrounds or whatever. We have everything from biologists to physicists to social scientists to engineers. And we're sending them out into a range of different professions, but we send them out with that message that spatial is special, but it's also extremely useful. I think that will do for me, Neil.
Yep, I'm just going to answer a couple of questions which have come in from the attendees, if there's time to do that. There's one question about, do we think it's necessary for all our students to know some programming language? For example, Python, for handling larger data sets. So that's actually something we were just discussing a couple of days ago. We do teach Python, and we do think that all students should understand a little bit the fundamental ideas of programming, of input-output flow control, basic data structures. But what we try to do is, because we're a large program, we try to allow students to specialize in different areas, like the areas that we see on this diagram. So some students will specialize in the spatial analytics, some will specialize in image processing, but many of the people working with Earth observation data do need to use Python to automate and to handle the larger volumes of data. So for us, and the market, I think, is telling us this in Europe and North America, that Python and similar programming abilities are similar. We do use the R language, which students who are perhaps not natural programmers, they find it easier to code using libraries with programs like R. And another question was relating to artificial intelligence, saying that should we be connecting more with artificial intelligence revolution? And certainly we see that in informatics. There are connections with AI, both in classification of imagery. You know, a lot of the standard AI techniques for image classification are now becoming mainstream in GIS, but also some of the methods for spatial interpolation using neural networks, for example. So this is why I think the message about not staying inside compartments and allowing our boundaries to extend and allowing our students to take courses, for example, in computer science, in artificial intelligence.
Vamos a hacer un par de preguntas. Voy a hacer yo una, digamos, en inglés, y después a lo mejor Esteban, y a la vez vamos a ir recogiendo de las consultas de la audiencia. Es importante en esto recalcar que tanto Neil como Bruce son nuestros académicos en el curso de bases de datos geoespaciales que hacemos en la Facultad de Ingeniería hacia fines de año, digamos, en lo que es el verano aquí en Chile, ¿no? Y eso es un poco la idea. Entonces, cualquier duda que tengan o alcance o algún, digamos, detalle más grande sobre lo que son las bases de datos geoespaciales, geoestadística o ese tipo de cosas, ¿no es cierto? Estamos a la escucha tanto en la escuela Geomensura, el académico Esteban Soto, que fue también, digamos, director, ¿no es cierto? Y estoy yo también en el decanato. I have a couple of questions for you folks, and as seasoned educators, as teachers, what principles do you think we need to teach this generation of surveying engineers, geomatics engineers students, so that they can take advantage of these new opportunities?
Go ahead.
That's a big question, that one, Alejandro. I think we need to teach them about the importance of data, the value of data, how that should be stored effectively, principally so that it can be shared. As I said much earlier, it's not about keeping our own data within our own hard drives or our own organizations. It's about making data available so that it can be shared publicly, potentially. So I think it's data, 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 and how to you teach very effectively how to create that data, but it's how to manage that data, and it's how to share that data, I think would be my number one point. Neil?
I suppose in terms of the way that we teach our programs, Bruce stresses the importance of data organization and data modeling very much. And I think, Bruce, you would say that the database needs to be at the center of many applications. And then my interests are about building on that core of data, conducting analysis that's meaningful and correct, and presenting those results. So I see a lot of cases where the underlying data is correct, but the presentation or the analysis of that data has errors in it. So for me, I want to teach my students the importance of knowing that there's error and uncertainty, to apply the right methods, and also to present and to visualize that information. Bruce talked earlier about non-specialists, about getting our information out to the public. And the public need information that can be easily assimilated, maybe on their phones or as simple maps or services. So sometimes I think we tend to overcomplicate things, and we need to think about what is the really important bit of information that we need to present. Part of that is still the old things like good cartography.
Yeah. Thanks. Esteban?
No, en particular no tengo ninguna consulta que realizar. Yo preferiría que se diera curso a las consultas que hacen terceros en este caso, sobre todo referidas a nuestro programa de base de datos espaciales, si es que existiese alguna. Yo prefiero darle curso a las consultas que está haciendo en este caso la audiencia respecto a nuestros invitados estelares el día de hoy.
¿Qué tiene Rodrigo en eso entonces? ¿Hay alguna pregunta por parte de la audiencia?
Sí, profesor. Uno de los profesores ya respondió sobre la inteligencia artificial, si puede ser una revolución en el mundo de la Big Data o del BIM. Otra persona nos pregunta, ¿cómo ven el futuro de la empleabilidad en general para un geólogo con conocimiento en Data Science? ¿Qué nos pueden decir ustedes desde su punto de vista?
It's a great question, and the question for Bruce's benefit is from Marcelo Sanchez, who says, how do you see the future of employment for somebody who's really originally a geologist? Is there a role for me in data science? Well, Bruce, you were a geologist.
Yes, I was going to say that is a very easy one for me to answer because I did my degree in geology as well. I think any science degree these days is teaching about data. And that's the important thing. So I went from being a geologist kind of 30 years ago, where we did mapping with very little technology, with paper maps and pens and colored crayons and so on, and moved very quickly to the digital world. If we look at the British Geological Survey in the UK, they are now collecting all of their data in a digital sense and making all of that data available in a digital sense. So you can go into their web services and you can integrate in a geological map in real time at different scales that is provided by the British Geological Survey actually for free. It's all about that understanding of data, and I think any spatial science, of which geology is definitely one, you will have no problem in terms of career. And many of our students are geologists, and they have gone on, sometimes they've gone into the geological profession and illustrating to their colleagues how the digital world impacts on geology. But sometimes they have moved from geology into other fields, data science, databases, spatial analysis, so on and so forth. So I have no worries. I think certainly we see in the UK and in Europe massive growth in the whole field of geospatial Earth observation, where a lot of money is being put into that. A lot of new companies are being set up to serve particular needs. Drivers include things like climate change, but all manner of other pressures. The COVID epidemic has in many ways focused the mind in terms of spatial science, because it's our epidemiological colleagues who are using spatial analysis, mapping and so on to understand the spread of COVID and how we're dealing with it. So that again has shone a light, a very bright light, on the benefits of spatial analysis. So I think the whole field is growing. We've seen no contraction during the COVID time whatsoever. All of our students, I think, if they haven't got jobs already, will get jobs very, very quickly. So it's a really exciting field, and I would have no worries in terms of employment, no matter what your background is.
Okay, thank you. ¿Hay alguna
Gracias,
otra?
profesor. Bueno, le damos la palabra también a nuestros panelistas que se han ido integrando, a ver si quieren opinar también sobre estas temáticas.
¿Puede hacer una pregunta?
Ignacio, veo a Ignacio Barra conectado.
¿Alguien está solicitando hacer una pregunta?
¿Puede hacer una pregunta?
There is a
Iván
question
Pereira por
from
acá está solicitando
Gustavo.
consulta.
Ya,
Adelante, Iván.
buenos días, buenas tardes. Pensando en lo que ustedes hablaron de la democracia de los datos y todo el Big Data y la inteligencia artificial y el vocablo Python, puede haber un peligro en el comportamiento humano, que las tecnologías regulen mucho al ser humano en su libre democracia de coexistir o reproducirse a futuro. ¿Qué piensan ustedes?
I'm terribly sorry, I'm going to have to ask for a translation because my Spanish is very poor.
If you want, you can use the interpretation button that is in the bottom of the page, so you can hear what the people in Spanish are saying.
Ah, okay.
We have a translator.
Great, thank you. So,
¿Le puedes repetir la pregunta a los profesores?
Sí, profesores. Mi nombre es Iván Ruiz. Pensando en la democratización de toda la información para estados libres como nosotros, como Inglaterra, Chile y muchos países que estamos dentro de democracias libres, ¿no creen que la información y el comportamiento geoespacial puede influir negativamente en los comportamientos humanos, como el caso de reproducirse o tener, por ejemplo, una existencia de pareja en vida, hombre-mujer, mujer-hombre o viceversa?
Okay, I've got that question now. I think that's a very interesting question, and I think as geospatial professionals, we have to be very careful about how our techniques and our information is used. I think we have to advise government carefully. I think we have to tell government when they're doing things that we think are not right. We have to ensure that our data is interpreted properly, and that assumptions are not being made that are inappropriate. But I think it's like many other fields that we can provide the data, we can provide the information, we can provide some degree of analysis, but then it's how that is used. And I think we certainly send our students out into the world of work with that in their mind, that they need to think carefully about these processes and ensure that they are not allowing data to be inappropriately used. Now, clearly that is a difficult thing to insist on, and it depends which organizations they're working for. But I think we do need to keep that uppermost in our minds, because the technology certainly can be misused, and I've seen examples of that where it's been used very inappropriately. So we have to guard against that. Neil, I don't know if you want to add anything to that one.
I think I'll just add a sort of a positive comment on the end of that. I think that many of our students are, in the end, most interested in data and technology. And in the past, they've been less aware of the implications of how the technology can be used for good and bad. But I think over the last few years, what we have is two things. We have students who are more politically aware, particularly in Latin America. But also, I think we have very good examples of positive uses of spatial data. We work, and we have many of our students join humanitarian projects. They volunteer. There's an organization called Map Action, and that goes into emergency situations and creates maps. It works with the Red Cross, for example, and it provides very short-term, immediate emergency mapping. And so I think for every example that we hear where the technology is not used very well, we can see positive examples of it being used in a really supportive and helpful and humanitarian way. So I think Bruce is correct to say that there is a limit to what we can do as educators, because individuals will use tools in different ways. But I think we can promote the positive examples.
And I think it is worth saying that we increasingly see our students having a very strong set of morals. They will push us to say, well, how is what you're teaching meeting the climate change goals, the UN climate change goals, for example. And I regularly also see students who say that there are certainly sectors they will not work in. The oil industry in Europe is finding it very, very difficult to find employees these days, because many students, including geology students, are saying, I will not work in oil. Because I think there is a moral imperative here. So I think through challenging our students, educating our students more broadly, the Scottish education system is regarded as a particularly broad one. We encourage them to develop these moral positions and to think very, very carefully about what they're doing as well as how they're doing. We're certainly not producing technocrats who are just creating systems and results for the sake of it. We do, as Neil says, very much encourage our students to think about the implications of what they're doing.
Excelente, profesor. Yo voy a pedirle a una persona que nos está haciendo preguntas, que se llama Gustavo Godoy, si puede hacer su pregunta en vivo, por favor. Tú puedes hacerla en español, Gustavo, nos van a interpretar a los profesores.
Ya, muchas gracias. Bueno, yo soy Gustavo Godoy.
Un poquito más fuerte, por favor, Gustavo.
Ok, no sé si
Perfecto.
ahora me escuchan mejor.
Sí,
Ya.
dale.
Bueno, yo soy Gustavo Godoy, trabajo en el Departamento de Ciencias Geodésicas y Geomática Soy ingeniero geofensor, magíster en gestión y evaluación de la calidad de la información geográfica, y ahora desarrollo mi trabajo en sostenibilidad. Y mi pregunta, bueno, antes de decir que estoy muy consciente de la importancia de los datos, creo que va a cumplir un rol muy importante dentro del cumplimiento de los objetivos de desarrollo de las Naciones Unidas. Y mi pregunta es, para los profesores, ¿cuáles son los desafíos de integración de la dimensionalidad de los datos espaciales en las bases de datos en relación, por ejemplo, con las Smart Cities? Y me refiero, por ejemplo, en cuanto a análisis integrales de análisis de flujo, la intensidad de materiales por unidad de servicio y el análisis de ciclo de vida en la toma de decisiones de las gobernaciones locales.
Shall I start on that one, Bruce? And then
that one, Neil,
you
go
can
on.
correct me. Gustavo, muchas gracias por la pregunta. Es una pregunta grande. But I think the starting point is that I think what you're correctly identifying is that the data models for GIS are only partly developed. That the data models that we have right now solve a lot of traditional problems. They're very good at presenting static information, and they're very good at presenting that in 2 dimensions. But what we're seeing with the examples now coming from BIM, for example, is we're seeing that there's a lot more use of temporal data, even continuous information, and information in 3 and therefore 4 dimensions. And we have to accept, I think, that the traditional GIS data models are really, there's been research for many years investigating this, but there are few examples of operational GI systems that can really handle that. And I think a good question is therefore, what's the way forward? Is it going to be that the conventional GIS developers like ESRI of this world, are they going to add those dimensions to their data models? Or are we going to look to a system of interconnected systems which will handle that? Perhaps with a database technology that understands these higher dimensions. And if that is possibly a way forward, then some of the work to extend databases for higher dimensions that Bruce might be thinking about here could be part of this solution. Maybe I could pass to you, Bruce.
Yes, certainly, Neil. Yes, I completely agree with your answer that I think GIS handles 2-dimensional data very well. Sort of handles 3-dimensional data, but 3-dimensional spatial analysis is not well developed. And once we get into a time dimension, 4th-dimensional data, that's problematic as well. I think the question from Gustavo went further in terms of how to integrate in social dimensions and so on too. And I think that comes down to the concept of linked data, of which you may have heard. But in this web-connected world, if we can make our data available as services, then we can connect not just databases together, but we can connect data together. And there are ways of doing that. I was having a conversation with colleagues this morning about the use of gazetteer data, which is something that is very dear to me, where we were looking at place names and locations for these place names. And that is a very effective way of linking data together that perhaps doesn't have a traditional geographical reference. So spatial reference is great. It allows us to say, well, okay, what's within a particular distance of a point or a polygon or whatever, but we can bring in a whole load more data if we can understand the names of places, uniquely identify these place names and assign coordinates to these. So we have examples in this country where we're beginning to do that rather a lot, and that's opening up historical data, for example. It's opening up local data because these are perhaps held in documents that have then been digitized. and it is also more comprehensible often to the general public. If you start talking about coordinates, latitude and longitude to a member of the public, they will just, their eyes will glaze over. Whereas if we can talk about place names, particularly place names that they understand, perhaps what we can call vernacular place names that are very personal to local areas. If we can make these comprehensible, then suddenly we can start connecting in a lot more data. So it's all about linked data, it's all about connectedness, it's all parts of this big data concept that is being built. Is that a helpful answer?
Por supuesto, profesor. Yo quiero dar la palabra también ahora a Teresa Montenegro, que le quiere hacer una pregunta directamente. Teresa, tienes que abrir tu micrófono y puedes hacernos tu pregunta directo. ¿Estás por ahí?
No, disculpa, lo que pasa es que se me activó sin querer, disculpen.
No, no te preocupes, no hay problema. Liz también quiere hacer una pregunta, también le abrí el micrófono. Yo tengo otras preguntas acá también, pero si quieres, Liz, hacer tu pregunta, este es el minuto. Bueno, profesor, en unos minutos más nosotros vamos a iniciar un módulo en el que vamos a estar conversando sobre por qué estudiar geomática, geomensura, y una de las preguntas que nos podría dar un espacio en eso es, abro esta pregunta a todos, a los profesores Bruce y Neil, y también a Ignacio, Alejandro, Rodrigo y Esteban. Como educadores experimentados, ¿qué principio creen ustedes que necesitamos para enseñar a esta generación de estudiantes de geomática para que puedan aprovechar estas nuevas oportunidades? Le doy primero la palabra a los profesores que nos están apoyando desde Edimburgo, para aprovechar también a Sebastián, que nos está haciendo la interpretación tan gentilmente.
Neil, do you want to start on this one?
Okay, I think that's a great question, and I didn't realize you're going to have a further discussion about this shortly. But each year when we review our content and we talk with our industrial panel, because we're very aware of the fact that most of our master's students are going to work in the industry afterwards, we always have to balance the principles that we want to teach and the technical skills that we want to teach. So, the market wants students who understand technologies. They understand how to operate GNSS. They can operate. They know how to create queries in SQL. They're confident in Python, and they can use ArcGIS or QGIS. So we're often having to balance this technical skill set with these longer principles, which we think are enduring principles, which persist irrespective of the version of the software. And I think some of them we've mentioned already. We think that understanding about the nature of the data is really fundamental. As Bruce said earlier, we have so many different diverse kinds of data in geospatial, much more diverse, I think, than almost any other subject area. Physicists have huge amounts of data, but it's about specific kinds of measurements. In geomatics, we have to be able to accept, and we have to be multilingual. We have to be able to understand all these different kinds of data, their limitations, their uses, and how to integrate them. So this principle of trying to understand the core principles by which we can integrate data. So this idea of location, attribute, and temporality, the basic frameworks for data integration in 2, 3, and 4 dimensions are very much at the core of all the things we do. But we also have to think about and recognize these uncertainties and the errors in our data, because in my area, which is it's very far from cadastral surveying or BIM, I work in natural resource management, and much of my data is much less certain. So I have to educate my students to also work with poor data, with incomplete data, and still be able to make useful analysis of that. So the process of starting with the data, then thinking about analysis. Why isn't a simple regression? Why can't we use a simple regression analysis on geographical information? You know, we have students with so many different backgrounds that many of them have never heard about the modifiable aerial unit problem or spatial autocorrelation. So there's many basic principles which we always have to teach. And then in cartography and presentation, we have to at least make sure the students understand the basis of datums and projections, but also visualization, how to present and how to take advantage of the new visualizations, such as the ones we saw today, how to use color, how to use animation, for example. So we suddenly realized that there's a very large set of skills and principles that we need to cover. Bruce, would you like to add on a few more?
Yes, I think the other thing that we're always told by employers is that we are educating not just for that first job. It's not just these few technical skills that get a student that first job. It's education for a career. So we point our students towards professional bodies. We point our students towards continuous professional development where they can continue to train. We invite our students back to alumni conference every year and allow them to update themselves and gain further information. So it's about connecting our alumni. It's about creating these opportunities. So it's not just the basic geospatial skills. It's also about, our employers again emphasize it's about can our students present themselves well? Can they stand up and convince an audience of the points they're making? Can they write clear, lucid reports? That will be another useful skill for employers. So there are these broader skills. Do they have the ability to analyze information? That doesn't just mean using ArcGIS. That means thinking about that information, looking at what others have said in papers and other reports and so on. So if they got that logical mind. And I guess one to add for the Chilean audience, if your students are looking to operate internationally, I'm afraid English is terribly important. It's easy for me. That's my first language, and my Spanish, as I say, is non-existent. But working internationally, it is the lingua franca. So having a good skill in English will ensure that your students have not just opportunities within Chile, which is important, but that they have opportunities elsewhere. And it means they can move around the world, they can learn even more, and they can bring these skills back to Chile to help your country, to build your economy, and so on.
Totalmente de acuerdo, profesor, con su respuesta y con la importancia del inglés. Es parte de lo que todas las carreras hoy en día están impulsando. Y más hoy día en esta época en que la tecnología nos permite tener comunicaciones tan fluidas como la que estamos teniendo afortunadamente con ustedes en este día. Y bueno, nosotros le cuento que vamos ahora a conversar con alumnos que están siguiendo la carrera en este minuto, y con chicos que están todavía en el colegio, para que ellos puedan hacer preguntas directamente a alumnos de la carrera, y romper ciertos paradigmas, ¿no? Le cuento que uno de los paradigmas que se repiten cuando uno conversa con chicos de colegio es que piensan que carreras como esta tienen una barrera muy importante en las matemáticas. Y les da susto ingresar a una carrera como esta por el paradigma de las matemáticas. ¿Qué piensa usted al respecto?
Yes, that's another interesting one that we get a lot of the time too, because some of our students are not mathematically oriented at all. We get some students with very strong maths. Actually, usually some of our overseas students who have much more traditional education than perhaps is available these days in the UK. So we particularly get your Chinese students, Greek students, German students, for example, who have very strong maths. Some of the UK students have very weak maths. I'm not very good at mathematics myself. But it's a balance. It's explaining to these students that there are many opportunities within the profession. Some of these, if they're interested in your writing algorithms and detailed coding, then they may well need mathematics. But actually, there are a whole series of other careers where they become users of the information, where they become interpreters of the information, where they are the vital link between the person that does the heavy mathematics and heavy computer programming and the user. And we often find that's a good opportunity for our students, where our students will work as consultants. They can speak to the users about the problems they have and how these might be solved, and they can explain that to the programmers and the people who do the heavy analysis, and then they can take the results and explain that back to the user. So they're kind of the interpreters that we're using very effectively today.
Gracias, profesor. Rodrigo, estamos ya a tiempo. Me gustaría que ustedes dieran las palabras de cierre en conjunto con Alejandro sobre este conversatorio. Vamos a pasar ya al módulo siguiente de nuestra Expo Geo. Los invito, por favor.
Gracias, Rodrigo Almendra. Me gustaría darle la palabra antes a Ignacio Barra, que nos ha estado acompañando, que participó del módulo y hizo una excelente presentación, para sus palabras al cierre de esta mañana en que hemos estado en torno a BIM, en torno a ciencia de datos, en torno a lo que se viene, a las tendencias. Ignacio.
Gracias, Rodrigo. Bueno, para cerrar un poquito, como yo te decía, BIM ya es una realidad. O sea, si la academia no lo está tomando dentro de su formación, yo creo que para los profesionales que van saliendo, sobre todo nosotros que estamos en Chile, que tenemos la posibilidad de que nuestro gobierno en este caso lo instauró como casi una norma oficial para los futuros proyectos, también impulsada probablemente por la parte privada, para que no se estén formando en esto, no vayan entendiendo cómo es, porque finalmente, para cerrar un poquito también, BIM es una base de datos. O sea, yo le hablaba de este formato IFC que hay, que sí, es un estándar abierto. O sea, cualquiera que sepa programación o que sepa muy poco programación lo puede ver en un blog de notas y a ver cómo está estructurado. Y se da cuenta que simplemente, ¿qué es lo que es? Es información geométrica del elemento que está ahí y datos, muchos datos. Por lo tanto, yo esos datos le puedo dar finalmente el uso que yo necesito para una construcción, para un diseño. Y esto están dando, como les digo, así que invitar a todos a que se vayan informando, capacitándose, para que si ya están trabajando o van a salir después al mundo laboral, puedan integrarse de mejor forma. Así que agradecerle una vez más a toda la gente aquí de Expo Geo la invitación, y para una próxima vez estamos en contacto.
Muchísimas gracias, Ignacio. Señor decano, Alejandro Velázquez, su palabra al cierre de este primer bloque que ha sido contundente.
Sí, así es, ha sido muy, muy bueno. Como decano no puedo menos que mencionar que ha sido una muestra de lo que es la ingeniería hoy en día y que se integra con las geociencias. Los geomensores antiguos éramos expertos en simplemente levantar información. Hoy día debemos también dar la interpretación y siempre mirar al usuario final para entregar ese buen servicio. Es una diferencia que se nota en los que ya estamos con, ¿no es cierto?, con el pelo blanco, entre los que nos formaron hace muchos, muchos años atrás versus los nuevos ingenieros e ingenieras que estamos formando. Necesitamos que nuestros futuros geomensores, geomáticos, geodestas y expertos en el área de las geociencias no solamente manejen, no solamente generen datos, sino que los puedan llegar a comunicar. Finalmente, darle las gracias a toda la audiencia. El día de hoy ha sido muy enriquecedor para la facultad, para la escuela. And I will give thank you very much to Neil and Bruce. Very, very happy to see you again. Y espero verlos a todas, a todos, as soon as possible, ¿no es cierto? ASAP. Nos vemos y muchas, muchas gracias.
Rodrigo, una última, un último pequeño alcance.
Adelante, Esteban, para el
sí,
cierre, que ya estamos pasando al siguiente
sí.
bloque.
Bueno, mencionar que nuestro programa de base de datos espaciales está en plena vigencia, solamente por el efecto de la pandemia no ha continuado. La universidad tiene un convenio formal con Edimburgo. Fuimos el año 2019 con Alejandro a establecer la pauta del convenio institucional. De manera que dentro de ese convenio está contemplado iniciativas como esta. Yo quisiera mencionar solamente para la gente que está observando este evento, que el programa de Ciencia de la Información Geográfica de Edimburgo es, si no el más antiguo, creo que es el primero en Gran Bretaña, y está rankeado siempre normalmente dentro de los 5 primeros. Y la Universidad de Edimburgo es una de las 30 mejores universidades del mundo. Nosotros tenemos el privilegio de contar con ella acá en el convenio que tiene nuestra universidad. De manera que ojalá pudieran seguir en contacto con nosotros para extender este vínculo con la comunidad de acá de Chile. Aprovecharlo al máximo. Es un portal, digamos, de salida también a los que quieran ir. Hace poco tiempo atrás fue Sebastián Valdivia, un amigo nuestro que es de la Universidad Católica, se tituló allá, y así ojalá pudieran ir a esta notable universidad, digamos, que, como les decía, tiene este convenio permanente con la presencia de Bruce, con la presencia de Neil y con la presencia de otras personas que han venido en el transcurso y que esperamos aumenten a futuro. Solamente eso, y dar las gracias por la invitación.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Esteban, muchas gracias, Bruce, Nils, muchas gracias,
Gracias.
a todos nuestros panelistas, a Dani Lobos, Rodolfo Palma, a Ignacio Barra, que se acaba de conectar, al profesor Cortesero, ¿cierto?, que se conectó desde España, por este bloque que ha sido formidable durante la mañana.